The castle stood on the edge of a forgotten village in northern Albania, where the mountains touched the clouds and the valleys swallowed sound. The locals called it Kalaja I Haruar, which meant the forgotten castle, and they said it was built long before their great-grandfathers were born. No one lived near it anymore because they believed something waited inside. Shepherds who wandered too close said they heard the sound of soft crying at night, carried by the wind that came from the crumbling towers. The older villagers warned the children never to follow that sound, because it belonged to the ghostly bride who once lived and died within those walls. Before starting, subscribe to our channel. There was an old man named Arben who lived at the edge of the forest not far from the castle. He had lived alone for years after his wife passed away, and the villagers often came to him for stories. He was not afraid of ghosts because he said time made the living more haunting than the dead. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, a young traveler arrived in the village. His name was Dritan, and he carried a small journal filled with notes about forgotten places. He said he was a historian searching for the truth behind old Albanian legends. When he asked the villagers about the castle, they grew silent. One of them muttered a prayer and another crossed himself before walking away. Only Arben agreed to speak to him. They sat by the fire in Arben's cottage as night gathered around them. The old man poured a cup of reiki and said that many years ago the castle had belonged to a noble family. The lord was powerful and proud, and he had a daughter named Elira, who was said to be the most beautiful woman in the region. Her eyes were bright as the Adriatic Sea, and her hair dark as the forest after rain. Men from distant lands came to ask for her hand, but her father refused them all, until one day a stranger arrived from the south, wearing a cloak of fine wool and carrying a sword engraved with silver. He called himself Marco and claimed to be of noble blood, though none in the region had heard of his family. Still, the lord was impressed by his charm and bravery, and promised him Elira's hand in marriage. The wedding was to be held within the castle walls during the full moon. The villagers remembered the preparations as grand and filled with music that echoed across the hills. But on the night before the ceremony, the castle fell silent. The servants who survived told stories that made little sense. Some said the groom vanished. Others said the bride disappeared into the forest wearing her white gown. When the sun rose the next morning, the gates were locked and no one was allowed inside. Weeks later, the lord himself vanished, and the castle was abandoned. Since then, no one had lived there. Dritan listened carefully, writing down every word in his notebook. He asked Arben if he had ever seen the ghost himself. The old man's eyes grew distant. He said that years ago, when he was young, he had lost his way during a storm and sought shelter inside the ruins. He found a hall covered in dust and broken stones. In the middle stood a table with a single candle still burning, though there was no wind and no flame. He thought it must be a trick of the light, but then he heard footsteps above him, slow and heavy, like someone dragging a long dress across the floor. When he looked up, he saw her, a woman in white walking along the balcony, her face hidden by a torn veil. She did not look at him, but he felt the cold of her presence like winter pressing against his skin. Then she vanished into the shadows. The fire cracked and the wind outside howled through the trees. Dritan leaned forward, his heart pounding. He asked if anyone else had seen her since. Arben nodded slowly and said that every year on the same night the villagers hear the sound of bells and the soft whisper of a woman calling a name no one understands. Some believe she waits for her groom to return. Others say she cannot rest because of a promise broken before death. When the fire burned low, Dritan thanked the old man and said he would visit the castle himself at dawn. Arben warned him not to go alone, but Dritan smiled, saying he believed in history, not in ghosts. He left before sunrise, carrying his notebook, his lantern, and his courage. The villagers watched him disappear into the mist that rolled down from the mountains. They prayed quietly because they knew no one who had gone to the castle after nightfall had ever returned unchanged. As Dritan reached the base of the hill, the air grew colder, and the sound of the village faded behind him. The path was overgrown and the stones slick with dew. He could see the outline of the castle above him, its towers jagged against the gray sky. Ravens circled overhead as if warning him to turn back, but he kept walking, his lantern flickering in his hand. He felt a strange pull toward the ruins, a whisper at the edge of his thoughts like someone calling his name softly from far away. By the time he reached the gates, the sun was gone, and the first shadow of night crept across the valley. The iron doors hung open as if waiting for him. He stepped inside the courtyard, his boots crunching on the gravel. The silence was heavy, like the breath of the earth holding still. He looked up at the broken tower where the windows gaped like empty eyes. Then he heard it, a faint sound somewhere deep within the castle walls. It was the sound of crying, a woman's voice, soft and endless. He raised his lantern and called out, but no answer came, only the echo of his own voice returning to him. And then for the first time he felt fear. The air inside the castle was thick and still, as if it had not been touched by breath for centuries. Dritan stepped slowly through the broken archway, holding his lantern high. Dust drifted like pale ghosts around him, and the walls were covered in moss that glowed faintly green in the dim light. He felt the weight of the place pressing against him, a silence so deep that it felt alive. Every footstep sounded like thunder beneath his ears, yet the crying he had heard did not fade. It came from somewhere deep within the halls, a soft, sorrowful weeping that rose and fell like the tide. He followed the sound through a corridor lined with torn tapestries. The faces of forgotten nobles looked down on him, their colors faded to gray. The smell of damp stone and decay filled the air. As he walked, his lantern flickered and he felt a sudden chill, as if someone had brushed past him. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The hall stretched behind him, empty and endless. He told himself it was only the wind, though there was no wind at all. He reached a grand staircase cracked by time, its marble steps veined with dark stains that looked too much like old blood. The crying grew louder above him. Dritan climbed slowly, one hand on the rail, one on the lantern. The flame trembled but did not die. When he reached the top, he found himself in a long gallery filled with broken mirrors. The glass was cloudy and shattered, yet in one of them he thought he saw movement. A flicker of white passing behind him. He spun around quickly but again saw only emptiness. He stared at his reflection, which looked pale and unfamiliar in the weak light. His face seemed older, as if the castle itself had drained the years from him. He continued down the gallery, until he reached a great door carved with symbols he did not recognize. The wood was dark and cold beneath his hand. As he pushed it open, the hinges groaned like something in pain. Inside was a vast hall lit by the faint glow of moonlight seeping through a hole in the roof. In the center stood a long wooden table covered in dust. On it lay a single candle melted into a pool of wax. He remembered Arben's story and felt his pulse quicken. He reached out to touch the candle and found that the wax was warm. Suddenly the air shifted, and the sound of crying stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the weeping. He turned slowly, his lantern casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. Then he saw her. At the far end of the hall, standing in a shaft of pale light, was a woman in a wedding dress. The fabric was torn and blackened by age, yet still shimmered faintly, as if woven with memory. Her veil hung low, hiding her face, and her hands were folded before her, as if in prayer. Dritan froze, unable to breathe. She did not move, but the air around her rippled with cold. He whispered softly, asking who she was. But the moment he spoke, her head lifted slightly. Beneath the veil, he glimpsed the hollow darkness of her eyes. The candle on the table burst into flame without a sound. The hall filled with the scent of old roses and ashes. She began to walk toward him, her steps light and slow, each one echoing like a heartbeat. Dritan stepped back until he hit the wall. The ghostly bride stopped only a few feet away. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she spoke, though her lips never parted. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. She asked why he had come, why he disturbed the silence of her waiting. Her words were like a whisper inside his bones. Dritan could not answer. He wanted to run, but his legs would not move. The bride raised her hand and the veil shifted, revealing a glimpse of her face. She was beautiful, but her beauty was broken like glass. Her eyes shimmered with tears that never fell, and her skin glowed faintly with the cold of the grave. She asked again why he had come, and this time he managed to speak. He said he wanted to know her story. For a moment she was silent. Then the hall darkened and the light of the lantern dimmed. She said she had once been called Elira, the daughter of the lord who built the castle. She said her heart had been promised to a man who never truly existed. Her father's pride had brought ruin upon them all. On the night of her wedding, she had waited for her groom, but he never came. Instead, she learned the truth that he was a thief who sought her father's treasure, and that he had fled when he could not find it. She had run after him into the storm, wearing her gown and veil, calling his name through the night. The next morning, they found her body by the cliffs, her hands still clutching the veil. Her father sealed the castle and vanished soon after. As she spoke, Dritan felt the temperature drop until his breath turned to mist. He realized that her sorrow bound her to this place, that her endless waiting had become the echo of the castle itself. She said she could not rest until the truth was known, until someone carried her story beyond these walls. Dritan nodded, trembling. He promised he would tell her tale to the world. For the first time she smiled, though the expression was more sorrow than peace. Then she reached out and touched his chest with her cold hand. He felt her fingers pass through him like smoke, and everything went dark. When he woke, he was lying on the floor of the hall. The candle was gone, the air was still and silent. His lantern lay beside him, dim but burning. He stood slowly, his head heavy with fog. He looked around, but the bride was nowhere to be seen. Only the faint scent of roses lingered. He left the hall, stumbling through the corridors until he found the open air. The dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky with pale gold. He turned back to the castle, its towers glowing in the weak light. For a moment, he thought he saw her standing at the window of the tower, watching him. Then she was gone, and only the empty stones remained. He made his way down the hill back toward the village. The villagers were waiting at the edge of the forest as if they had known he would return. When they saw him, they crossed themselves in silence. He said nothing until he reached Arben's cottage. There he told the old man everything. Arben listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly and said that the bride had finally found someone to hear her truth. Dritan opened his notebook and began to write, though his hand trembled. He wrote her name, her story, and her sorrow. When he finished the last word, he felt a strange calm, as if a burden had lifted from the air. That night he dreamed of the castle again, but it was no longer dark and broken. The halls were filled with light, and the sound of laughter drifted through the windows. He saw the bride walking down the staircase, her veil lifted, her face serene. As she reached the door, she looked at him one last time and whispered, "Thank you." Then she stepped into the light and was gone. He awoke at dawn, his heart filled with quiet peace. He looked toward the mountains and saw the castle shrouded in mist, but somehow it seemed smaller, less haunting. The curse that had bound it through the centuries had faded with the telling of her story. He closed his notebook, placed it beside him, and whispered her name once more to the wind. Days passed after Dritan's return from the castle, and the villagers began to speak his name with a kind of respect they had not shown before. Some said he was blessed, others whispered that he was marked by the spirit he had seen. The old man Arben told him that when someone carries a ghost story, they also carry a piece of that soul, until it finds its final rest. Dritan listened quietly, though he did not truly believe in curses. He only believed in truth and in the strange weight that truth sometimes carried. He decided to stay in the village a little, longer, to study the history of the castle and perhaps find proof of Elira's life. He spent his mornings in the ruins of an old church, searching through weathered books and crumbling records. The papers were fragile with age, but within them he found fragments of names and dates that matched the tale Arben had told. The castle had indeed belonged to a nobleman named Lord Peter, who ruled the valley generations ago. One entry mentioned his daughter Elira, who was promised to a man from the south, but the writing ended abruptly, as if someone had torn the page away. Dritan traced the edge of the missing paper with his finger, and felt the faint scent of dust and time rise from it. He wondered who had removed the words and why. Each night when the wind rose from the mountains, he thought he heard faint whispers outside his window. Sometimes he dreamed of footsteps on the castle stairs, or the sound of a veil brushing stone. The dreams were not frightening, but they left him restless. One evening he returned to Arben's cottage carrying the torn record. The old man studied it under the flickering light of a candle and nodded slowly. He said that the missing page was not lost but hidden. He told Dritan that long ago the priests of the region often burned records that spoke of sorrow, believing that grief could stain the living if written down. Dritan frowned and said that the truth should never be buried, no matter how painful. Arben smiled a little and said that pain sometimes guards the truth better than any lock. The next morning, Dritan decided to visit the ruins again, this time in daylight. The mist had lifted and the path was clear. though the air still carried a chill. Birds circled above the broken towers, and the forest around the hill seemed to watch in silence. As he stepped through the gates, the memory of the ghostly bride returned to him like a whisper. He moved carefully through the courtyard, taking notes and sketches. He found carvings on the walls half erased by time, but among them one symbol caught his eye. It was a circle with 2 crossed lines, the same mark he had seen on the door of the hall, where he had met her. He drew it in his notebook, then noticed that beneath the symbol someone had scratched words into the stone. They were faint, but he could read them. "Forgive me, Elira." He knelt closer, tracing the letters with his finger. The message was old, but not ancient, perhaps written by a man long after the castle had fallen. Could it have been her father or the groom who betrayed her? He felt a shiver run through him, though the sun was warm on his back. He continued exploring until he reached the northern tower. The stairs were broken, but he climbed them carefully until he reached the highest chamber. The room was small, filled with fallen beams and bird nests. In the corner lay a wooden chest half buried in dust. He pried it open with the edge of a stone. Inside were fragments of cloth, a rusted mirror, and a small book bound in leather. He opened it and saw handwriting so delicate it looked like it might fade if touched too hard. The words were written in Albanian, but old and formal. It began with the name Elira. Dritan's hands trembled as he turned the fragile pages. It was her diary. The first entries were simple, filled with descriptions of her daily life, the gardens, the music, the lessons in the hall. But then the tone changed. She wrote about a man who had arrived from the south, a man she loved, though her father distrusted him. She wrote of promises whispered under the moon and of dreams of escape. The final pages were smeared as if by tears. She wrote that her father had discovered the truth, that the man had lied about his name, and that he sought not love, but gold hidden beneath the castle. Her last words were unfinished, as if she had tried to write while fleeing. The ink trailed off into a single line across the page. Dritan closed the diary and sat in silence. He felt her presence in the room, though it was only the echo of her words. He whispered that he understood now that her sorrow had not been born of lost love alone, but of betrayal from both the man she loved and the father who sought to control her. She had died between their sins, caught in a web not of her making. He promised again that he would tell her truth not as a ghost story, but as the tale of a woman wronged and forgotten. As he spoke, a gust of wind swept through the tower, carrying the faint scent of roses. For a moment he thought he heard her voice again, softer now, almost at peace. He carried the diary back to the village and showed it to Arbin. The old man's eyes filled with tears as he turned the pages. He said the story had been waiting for someone to find it, someone who listened not with fear, but with understanding. Dritan asked if he thought the spirit was free now. Arbin said, "Freedom is not something the living can give to the dead, it is something the dead must find for themselves." Still, he believed that the telling of her story had opened the door to her rest. That night, the villagers gathered in the square for the first time in years. They built a fire, and Arbin told them what Dritan had discovered. The people listened in silence, some weeping softly, others staring into the flames. When the story ended, they said prayers for Elira's soul and for the forgiveness of those who had wronged her. The fire burned high into the night, and for a moment a gentle wind moved through the valley, carrying with it the faint sound of distant bells. The villagers looked toward the castle and saw a soft white light glowing at the tower's window. Then it faded slowly like breath in the cold. When morning came, the castle stood silent and still. The villagers who had once feared it now looked upon it with quiet respect. Dritan prepared to leave the village, his notebook and Elira's diary packed safely in his bag. He thanked Arbin for his kindness and promised to return one day. Arbin gave him a small silver pendant shaped like the circle and crossed lines carved into the wall. He said it was a symbol of truth and forgiveness, and that it would remind Dritan of the story he had carried. Dritan took it and wore it around his neck. As he left the village, the road stretched long and winding through the hills. The morning sun touched the tops of the trees, and the air was filled with the scent of pine. He looked back once at the castle, barely visible in the distance. It no longer looked haunted, only lonely and ancient, like a memory that had finally learned how to rest. He walked on until the path vanished into the forest, and the sound of the village faded behind him. The world ahead felt wide and alive, filled with stories waiting to be found. But in the quiet between the rustle of leaves and the song of birds, he thought he heard a voice whisper one last time, not in sorrow but in gratitude. It was the voice of Elira, the ghostly bride who once roamed Albania's forgotten castles, now at peace at last. The city was different from the quiet mountains and old stones of Albania. When Dritan returned to Tirana, he felt as though he had stepped from a dream into the noise of the waking world. Cars crowded the streets and people hurried past without looking at one another. Yet in his mind he still heard the soft voice of Elira and the whisper of wind that had followed him from the hills. He rented a small room near the university and spent his days writing her story. He wanted to tell it as she had lived it with truth, not as a tale of ghosts but as a story of love, betrayal and sorrow turned into legend. Each night he sat by the window and wrote until dawn. The city lights glimmered below like stars fallen to the ground. He wrote of the castle of her father, of the storm of the lost groom. The words came easily as if guided by her unseen hand. At times he felt her near him, a faint scent of roses, or the brush of cold air against his skin. When he paused to rest, the silence felt different from before, not heavy but patient, as if she waited for him to finish. One afternoon he visited the National Archives, searching for any record of Lord Peter and his daughter. The clerk was an old woman with sharp eyes and a voice like dry paper. She led him to a section few visited where the oldest documents were kept. There he found a small collection of letters sealed with a crest shaped like the same circle, and crossed lines he wore around his neck. He opened them carefully. They were written by Lord Peter himself. The early letters spoke of pride and power, and the building of his castle. But the last one was different. It was addressed to his daughter. In the letter he wrote of regret and guilt. He said that when he discovered the truth about her lover, he had locked her inside the castle to keep her from running away. He said he had meant to protect her, but his anger had turned to cruelty. When he went to free her the next morning, she was gone. He searched the valley for days until he found her body near the cliffs. He buried her in the family crypt beneath the castle and sealed the gates forever. His final words were a plea for forgiveness. Dritan closed the letter, his hands shaking. The legend had not lied, the pain had been real and deep. He returned to his room and placed the letter beside the diary. Together they told the story of two hearts bound by love and pride, destroyed by silence. That night he began writing again, weaving their words into one. The more he wrote, the lighter he felt, as if each sentence carried away a little of the sorrow that had haunted the valley for centuries. When he finished the final chapter, he leaned back and closed his eyes. The air in the room was still but warm. He heard a faint whisper near his ear saying "thank you," in a voice soft as the wind through leaves. The next morning he sent his manuscript to a small publisher that focused on forgotten folklore. Weeks passed with no reply. He began to think they had ignored his story or dismissed it as another ghost tale. Then one day he received a letter. The publisher said the story was unlike anything they had ever read. It was not only haunting but human. They wanted to publish it under the title The Bride of the Forgotten Castle. Dritan felt a strange joy mixed with quiet disbelief. He had done what he promised her. Her story would live beyond the ruins, beyond the whispers of the valley. The book was published in autumn. Its cover showed a faded image of a castle bathed in mist and the silhouette of a woman standing at a window. It sold modestly but steadily. Readers wrote letters saying the story moved them, that it felt more like truth than myth. Some said they dreamed of the bride after reading it, and that she no longer seemed frightening but peaceful. Dritan kept each letter in a small box beside his desk. Months later, he returned to the village to visit Arban. The old man was weaker now, his hair white as snow, but his eyes still bright. He greeted Dritan with a smile, saying he had known he would return. When Dritan showed him the book, Arban touched the cover with trembling hands. He said the valley would no longer fear the castle, because her name had been spoken with kindness at last. They walked together to the hill where the ruins stood. The air was cool, and the mountains shone with early winter light. The castle looked quieter than before, its stones softened by time. Dritan placed a copy of the book near the gate along with a single white rose. The wind stirred and carried the petals across the ground. For a moment the air shimmered with warmth, though the day was cold. Arban said softly that she was listening. Dritan bowed his head and whispered her name. He felt tears rise, though he could not say why. He thought of her standing alone in her white gown, waiting for a love that had turned to ash. He thought of her courage, of her endless patience through centuries of silence. He said that no one would forget her now. As they turned to leave, Arbin paused and looked back. He said that the dead do not ask for worship, only remembrance. He told Dritan to keep writing because stories were the only bridges between worlds. Dritan nodded. He knew now that every myth began with a truth, and every ghost was once a beating heart. That night they sat by the fire in Arbin's cottage. The wind outside was gentle, and the sound of the forest drifted through the window. Arbin fell asleep in his chair, his breathing soft and steady. Dritan sat awake watching the flames. At some point he felt a sudden warmth beside him, and the faintest scent of roses. He turned, and for just a heartbeat he saw her standing near the doorway. She smiled not with sorrow but with peace. Then she faded like mist in sunlight. When morning came, Arbin was gone. He had passed quietly in his sleep, his face calm. Dritan buried him near the forest with the pendant he had given him placed on his chest. The villagers came to pay their respects and said the valley would remember both of them, the old man who guarded the story, and the traveler who gave it voice. Dritan stayed one more night in the village. As the moon rose, he walked to the edge of the forest and looked toward the castle. The mist that once clung to it was gone. In its place was clear air, and the faint glow of dawn already rising beyond the mountains. He felt no fear, only a strange sense of home. He whispered goodbye to Elira and to Arbin, and then turned away, knowing some stories never truly end. They only become part of the land itself. Months passed after Dritan buried Arbin and left the valley behind, but the memory of the place lingered in his heart like a shadow that never truly faded. His book continued to reach people across borders and languages. Letters arrived from readers in distant lands who claimed they too had old castles haunted by sorrowful brides. Some sent photographs of ruins where the air felt thick with forgotten stories. Each message reminded him that Elira's story was not only hers, but part of something larger, a web of grief and love that bound the world together. He answered every letter, carefully signing them with his full name and the phrase "for those who still wait." He traveled often now, giving talks about folklore and truth. He told audiences that legends were not born to frighten but to remember. He spoke of Elira not as a ghost, but as a woman whose heart had outlasted centuries. Sometimes when he stood before a crowd, he could feel her presence at the edge of the light, listening quietly as she once did in the ruins. He never mentioned the scent of roses that sometimes filled the room or the strange calm that followed his words. One winter evening, after a lecture at a university in Vienna, he was approached by a young woman with pale hair and eyes the color of frost. She held a worn copy of his book and asked him to sign it. When he did, she smiled softly and said she came from a small village near the Albanian border. She said there was another castle near her home with a story almost the same as his. A bride, a broken promise, a curse that lingered through the centuries. Dritan felt a shiver that was not from the cold. He asked her to tell him more, but she only said that every land has its own Elira, and that some spirits do not rest even when remembered. Then she thanked him and disappeared into the crowd. That night he could not sleep. Her words echoed in his mind. He dreamed of a road winding through fog, and of many castles rising like shadows across a dark horizon. In each window he saw a pale figure waiting. He woke before dawn, his heart heavy and his thoughts restless. He wondered if Elira's peace had somehow awakened others still trapped in their sorrow. He told himself it was only imagination, but the feeling stayed. He decided to travel again, this time back toward the Balkans, to collect more forgotten legends. He visited villages tucked between mountains where old stories still clung to the stones. He listened to shepherds speak of lights that moved across the hills at night. He spoke to widows who told him of spirits that sang by the river. In every place he found echoes of the same sorrowful shape, the woman who waited, the love that betrayed, the curse that never died. He began writing them all down, not to chase ghosts, but to understand why humanity kept retelling the same pain in different tongues. Not one night, while staying in a remote inn near Lake Ohrid, he sat by the window and read Elira's diary again. The pages were delicate, but still carried her scent, faint and faded. As he read, he noticed something he had missed before: a small note written in the margin of one page in a different hand. The words were faint, almost erased, but he could make them out. Said, "I will return to set it right." He froze, staring at the sentence. The handwriting was not Elira's. It was the same script from Lord Petar's letter. He felt a chill crawl through him. Had her father written it before he vanished? Perhaps he too had been bound by the curse, unable to find peace until her story was told. He closed the diary and stared into the dark water of the lake. The moon reflected on the surface like a broken coin. He whispered their names together, Elira and Petar. For a moment he thought he saw two figures standing at the far edge of the water, one in white and one in shadow, holding hands. Then the reflection rippled and vanished. The next morning he walked along the lakeshore. The mist was thick and the world felt distant. He found an old chapel half buried in ivy. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with age. On the altar was a stone carving of a woman holding a lily. Beneath it was an inscription worn almost smooth by time. It read, "For those who were silenced, may their voices find the wind." He placed his hand upon the stone and felt warmth pulse through it. The pendant around his neck seemed to glow faintly, though no sunlight touched it. He whispered that he would carry their stories until his last breath. In the years that followed, Dritan became known across Europe as the chronicler of forgotten souls. People invited him to speak at gatherings of historians, poets, and spiritual scholars. They called him the voice of the unseen, though he always said he was only a listener. His hair grew gray and his face lined with time, but his eyes still carried the same quiet fire that had led him into the castle long ago. He kept the pendant close, always beneath his shirt, as if afraid the world would take it from him. One evening, many years later, he returned once more to Albania. The village had changed. There were new houses and electric lights along the streets, but the mountains were the same ancient guardians watching over all. The castle still stood, though much of it had crumbled. The villagers no longer feared it, but treated it as part of their heritage. Children played near its walls during the day, and couples climbed the hill to watch sunsets from the tower. Dritan walked among them, unnoticed, an old man in a worn coat, his steps slow but steady. He climbed the path alone at dusk. The air was cool and clear. When he reached the gate, he stopped and looked around. The ruins were silent but not empty. He could feel something waiting, not in sorrow but in welcome. He walked to the courtyard where wildflowers now grew among the stones. He knelt and touched the ground, whispering her name. The wind rose softly around him, carrying the scent of roses, and for a moment he felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. He smiled and closed his eyes. The villagers who came up later found him sitting there, peaceful, his notebook open beside him. The page was blank except for a single line written in his familiar hand. It said, "Her story is told, the waiting is over." They buried him beside Arbin near the forest, where the first whisper of her tale had begun. Some nights the villagers said they saw two figures walking together near the ruins, one in white, one in gray, their forms glowing faintly in the moonlight. Others said it was only the wind moving through the flowers. But those who believed left roses at the castle, gate each spring whispering her name and his together, and so the legend of the ghostly bride and the man who freed her sorrow became part of Albania's living memory, not a tale of fear, but of love, patience, and redemption. The castle no longer belonged to the dead, but to the stories that gave them peace. The night after Dritan's burial, the wind moved through the Albanian hills like a sigh from the earth itself. The villagers locked their doors early, but many stayed awake, listening. They said it was only the mountain wind, yet the sound was softer and more rhythmic, almost like two voices murmuring together. The ruins stood quiet beneath the pale moon, their stones gleaming like bones washed clean by rain. In the courtyard where Dritan had sat, there were rose petals scattered, though no one had brought flowers that night. The villagers spoke of it the next day and agreed it was his spirit, taking the final steps with hers through the veil that separates the living from the remembered. Years passed and the legend of the ghostly bride changed shape again, as all legends do. Children grew up hearing about the woman who waited for her lover and the man who gave her peace. Some said she was a saint who blessed the mountains with safety. Others said she was still a guardian of the valley, keeping travelers from harm. Every generation added something new. In some versions, Dritan became a wandering monk who carried light through forgotten lands. In others, he was a scholar who turned into a spirit himself to guide lost souls. The story never faded. It only changed color like fabric washed by time. One spring, a group of historians from Italy came to the village to record local myths. They were surprised by how vividly the people spoke of Elira and Dritan. An old woman told them she had seen a man in gray, walking by the lake at dusk reading from a book that glowed faintly even in the shadows. She said he never looked up, but the air around him smelled of wild roses and old parchment. They laughed politely and thanked her, but that night, one of the younger researchers claimed he saw the same figure reflected in the water. The next day, he refused to speak about it and left for home without explanation. The castle became a small pilgrimage site for travelers who believed in spirits. Artists came to paint the ruins. Musicians composed melodies inspired by the story. A filmmaker from Germany made a short film about the ghostly bride and her writer. It won awards for its haunting tone, though locals said the director had captured more truth than he realized. He had chosen to shoot at night under the real moonlight, and every member of the crew reported hearing whispers from the walls. The sound engineer even quit after claiming he had recorded a woman's sigh, though no actress was present that night. In time, the Albanian government restored part of the castle to preserve it as a cultural landmark. They placed a plaque near the entrance with a brief inscription about the legend. Read here, a bride once waited for her love and a writer once gave her voice. May their story remind us that even in silence, love endures. Visitors often stopped to read it, then stood quietly for a moment, as if expecting something to happen. Some said they felt a soft brush of air across their hands like a gentle touch. Others said nothing but left with an unexplainable peace in their hearts. One summer, an elderly man arrived from the north carrying a wooden box wrapped in cloth. He introduced himself as Arben's grandson, though no one could remember when Arben had ever had a family. The man said his grandfather's journals had been found among old archives, and that one of them mentioned Dritan and the ghostly bride. He had come to donate the box to the small museum near the castle. Inside was the pendant that had belonged to Elira, still gleaming softly, as if the years had not touched it. The curator placed it under glass beside Dritan's diary, which had been recovered from his home. Strangely, the pendant seemed to glow faintly every evening at twilight. Some said it was the light from the windows, but others swore it pulsed with its own quiet rhythm, like a heartbeat remembering love. As time went on, the legend spread beyond Albania. It reached students in America through translated books and podcasts that told stories of forgotten folklore. It appeared in digital forms where people shared their own ghostly encounters. Some travelers made the journey just to stand among the ruins and whisper their secrets to the stones, hoping for peace or forgiveness. The place became known not as haunted but as healing. The air there felt alive but not heavy, and people left feeling lighter, as though the mountain itself listened and took their sorrow. Decades later, a young writer from Tirana decided to revisit the story. Her name was Mira, and she had grown up hearing her grandmother tell the tale by candlelight. She wanted to uncover what was true and what was myth. She traveled to the village and stayed for a month interviewing locals and walking the same paths Dritan had walked. One night she sat alone in the courtyard and began reading aloud from his diary. The moon hung low and silver above the towers, and the air smelled faintly of roses. As she reached the final page, she felt a calmness wrap around her like an embrace. She whispered thank you into the night, though she did not know to whom. A breeze stirred, and for an instant she thought she heard two voices whispering her name softly, as if in blessing. When she returned home, she wrote her own book, blending fact and legend into one long narrative. She ended it with a single line that mirrored the last entry in Dritan's diary. It read, "The story is never over. It only changes who tells it." Her book became known throughout Europe and was translated into several languages. Readers described it as haunting yet peaceful, as if the words themselves carried the sound of wind moving through ancient stones. Some even said that while reading it they smelled roses, though no flowers were nearby. Mira never explained where she found her inspiration beyond saying she had simply listened. And perhaps that was the true inheritance left by Dritan and Elira, not the story itself, but the silence between words where love and loss become the same gentle truth. Years rolled on like a river that never stops, and the legend of the ghostly bride lived quietly inside the world's imagination. The castle aged but did not crumble. It became a symbol of something beyond sorrow, beyond fear. Tourists who visited no longer came to be frightened but to feel something deeper, a kind of echo from another life. The villagers built a small garden at the base of the hill, planting white roses in rows that faced the ruins. Every spring they bloomed in perfect silence, turning the old stones into a sea of pale petals under the sunlight. People said that when the wind moved through them, they could hear the faint sound of a woman laughing softly, as if she had finally found joy. Mira continued her work traveling across the Balkans, collecting forgotten tales. She found that every land had its own ghostly bride, its own spirit, who had waited too long, its own story of love that refused to die. In each version, the setting changed, the names changed, but the soul of the tale was the same. There was always someone who waited and someone who remembered. She began to think of Elira not as one woman, but as the memory of every woman who had ever been silenced by time and sorrow. She spoke of this idea at universities, saying legends were the world's way of keeping promises alive. Students listened in awe, and some began writing their own versions, weaving modern hearts into ancient myths. One evening, Mira returned once more to the Albanian castle, now called the House of the Waiting Bride. She went alone, carrying only her notebook and a single candle. She wanted to spend one night there to see if the stories of peace were true. As she climbed the hill, the sky deepened into violet, and the air cooled. The moon rose behind her, casting a faint silver glow over the ruins. When she entered the courtyard, she found it quiet except for the whisper of leaves. She placed the candle on a stone and sat beside it. The light flickered and stretched across the walls like breathing shadows. She began to speak softly, not in prayer, but in gratitude. She thanked the nameless forces that had kept the story alive, the souls who had carried it through the centuries, and the writer who had given the ghost her voice. Then she opened Dritan's diary, which she always carried with her. The ink had faded, but the words still seemed alive. She read aloud the last lines about the waiting being over, and when she finished, the air shifted gently, as if something unseen had drawn closer. The candle flame did not flicker, it steadied and grew brighter. Mira felt warmth touch her cheek, and though she was alone, she smiled without fear. She whispered, "Elira, are you still here?" There was no answer, but the scent of roses filled the air stronger than ever before. It was not the scent of death, but of life, and the candlelight shimmered as though it had become a heart beating in time with her own. Then she felt a second warmth beside her, softer than air. For a moment she thought she saw two faint outlines in the moonlight, a woman in white and a man in gray. Their hands entwined, their faces turned toward her. She felt no dread, only tenderness. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came, only the hush of the wind that followed like words too sacred for the world to hear. Mira nodded and whispered, "I will keep telling it." The figures smiled and slowly faded until only the candle remained. The next morning, the villagers found her asleep in the courtyard, her notebook resting on her lap. She awoke to the sound of footsteps and sunlight filtering through the ruins. She told them she had seen nothing unusual yet. Her eyes carried the calm of someone who had been touched by something beyond explanation. When she opened her notebook later that day, she discovered a faint line written in delicate handwriting she did not recognize. It said, "Thank you for remembering." The ink was pale and glimmered faintly like moonlight. She tried to explain it away, but deep inside she knew she had been answered. Years later, Mira's book was adapted into a play performed across Europe. Audiences wept as the ghostly bride took her final bow under soft white light, while the actor playing Dritan closed his eyes in peace. Each performance ended with silence, no applause for several seconds, as if the crowd feared to break the spell. Some theaters reported a strange scent lingering after the curtain fell. The scent of roses, faint but unmistakable. The directors dismissed it as stage perfume, though no such prop existed. Mira attended one of the final performances in Tirana. As the actors took their bows, she felt tears rise unbidden. When the lights dimmed, she looked toward the empty corner of the stage, and for a brief instant thought, she saw a woman standing there beyond the set, dressed in a simple white gown, smiling gently before fading into the dark. Mira knew then that stories were not merely told, they were lived. Again, each time someone listened with an open heart. As she grew older, she continued to write not only about ghosts, but about memory, love, and the way sorrow turns into light when shared. She often said that every story is a form of resurrection, a small defiance against forgetting. Her final book was called The Wind That Remembers, and in its dedication she wrote for those who wait, and for those who finally find peace. When it was published, she visited the castle one last time to leave a copy on the stone where Dritan had once sat. She whispered his name and Elira's together and left before sunset. The villagers say that on quiet nights, a faint glow can still be seen near that stone, as if two souls sit together reading aloud. The white roses bloom thicker each year, even in harsh winters, and travelers who pass through claim the air around the ruins feels strangely kind. The story of the ghostly bride no longer belongs to fear or loss. It has become a tale of love's endurance, carried by voices that refuse to fade. The years passed, and the world around the old Albanian castle changed once more. The village grew into a small town, and the dirt roads were paved with stone. Tourists arrived from faraway places bringing cameras and curiosity. But even with the noise of new life, the air around the castle still held its quiet soul. The white roses at the foot of the hill became a symbol of peace and remembrance. Every spring, people gathered to plant more of them, children and elders working side by side, their laughter rising toward the sky where once sorrow had lingered. It was said that the scent of those roses could calm even the most troubled heart, and that those who visited left feeling lighter than when they came. Mira's final book spread far and wide across languages and continents. It was read in schools and universities as a work that blurred the line between legend and truth. Her words carried a soft power, the kind that does not shout but stays. When she passed away in her sleep many years later, her ashes were scattered by the villagers on the hill where she had once met the ghostly bride. That evening the sunset was unlike any other. The clouds burned in gold and rose, and a gentle wind moved through the ruins carrying the scent of flowers. Some said they saw three faint figures walking together along the ridge, a woman in white, a man in gray, and another woman with a notebook in her hands. When the light faded, they were gone, but the calm that followed stayed long after. The castle eventually became a cultural sanctuary. Poets, musicians, and artists came to create in silence there. The local council forbade commercial use of the site, saying it was a place for souls, not profits. Every year on the anniversary of Dritan's death, people held a night vigil, where they told old stories by candlelight. They did not speak of ghosts anymore, but of memory and love, and the strange way stories keep the world breathing. Children recited lines from Mira's books, and elders told how, once long ago, a woman's sorrow had turned into peace through the kindness of a single man who had chosen to listen. One night during such a vigil, heavy rain began to fall, yet none of the candles went out. The villagers whispered that the bride herself was shielding the flames. When the rain stopped, the sky cleared and a full moon appeared, brighter than anyone could remember. The entire castle seemed to shimmer faintly under its glow. Someone began to sing an old Albanian lullaby, and soon everyone joined their voices, blending like wind through leaves. For a few brief moments, the boundary between legend and life disappeared. They were all part of the same story, just as Dritan had once believed. Years later, a traveler from Japan visited the place after reading about it in Mira's translated book. He was a historian of myths and spiritual tales, and had traveled the world collecting stories of wandering souls. He stood before the castle at dawn with his notebook open, and said aloud in his own tongue that he could feel peace here, not sorrow. He wrote that some stories are not warnings but blessings, and that the bride who once haunted the stones had become their protector. When he left, he bowed toward the ruins and said, "Thank you for teaching me silence." The legend kept moving across oceans, changing again as it went. In Mexico, it became the tale of a weeping woman who finally found rest in the arms of a writer. In Finland, it turned into the story of a spirit bride who thawed the heart of winter. In Kenya, it was told as a song about a woman made of mist who guarded travelers in the hills. The names changed, the details shifted, but always the ending stayed the same. The waiting was over, the love endured. The story that began in a forgotten Albanian castle had become part of the world's shared soul. And still some say that when the moon is full and the valley quiet, you can see two faint shapes walking the path that leads from the ruins to the forest, hand in hand, their steps unhurried, their forms glowing like the breath of dawn. They leave no footprints, only the scent of roses that lingers in the air long after they fade. The villagers no longer fear them. They greet them softly with whispers and leave flowers at the gate. They know the spirits mean no harm, that they have become guardians of the place they once haunted. It is said that if you sit alone in the courtyard and close your eyes, you can hear the faintest echo of a woman's Laugh carried on the wind, followed by the sound of pages turning as if someone were still writing the next chapter. Some believe it is Dritan still recording the lives of those who come to listen. Others say it is simply the mountain speaking in its old tongue. But no one denies the peace that lives there. Even skeptics who visit leave with quiet hearts. Perhaps that is how legends survive, not through fear or proof, but through the small changes they make inside those who hear them. The ghostly bride who once roamed Albania's forgotten castle no longer walks in sorrow. She walks in memory and art in every story that reminds us love can outlast even death. And maybe that is all she ever wanted to show, that nothing truly fades if someone still remembers. The castle stands still today, surrounded by white roses and the endless sky, and when the wind moves through the valley, it carries a whisper, not of pain but of gratitude, a promise between the living and the dead that every voice once silenced will someday be heard again. And so her story continues, not as haunting, but as a lullaby sung by the earth itself, a gentle song for those who wait and for those who have finally found their way home.